Before we dive into this story, I need you to hit that subscribe button and tap the bell icon. This is one of the most devastating and hidden chapters in American history, and it's a story that needs to be told. I'll be sharing facts that will shock you, testimonies from survivors that will move you to tears, and revealing the truth about how an entire community was erased in less than 24 hours. What if I told you that there was once a place in America where black families owned luxury businesses, lived in beautiful homes, and created wealth that rivaled the finest communities in the nation? What if I told you that in 1921, all of this was destroyed in a single day by thousands of armed white residents who burned it to the ground, killed hundreds of people, and then tried to erase it from history books for nearly a century? This is the story of Greenwood, Oklahoma, a community so prosperous it was called Black Wall Street. But this is also the story of how jealousy, racism, and hatred led to one of the worst acts of domestic terrorism in American history. Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you'll understand not just what happened, but why it matters today more than ever. In 1906, when most of America was still dealing with the aftermath of slavery and the harsh realities of Jim Crow laws, something extraordinary was happening in Tulsa, Oklahoma. A wealthy African-American landowner named Ottawa W. Gurley made a decision that would change history. Born in 1868 to formerly enslaved parents in Alabama, Gurley had worked as a teacher and with the U.S. Postal Service before making his way to Oklahoma. Gurley had a vision that seemed impossible at the time. He purchased 40 acres of land in Tulsa with one specific condition: it would be sold only to African Americans. This wasn't just about real estate. This was about creating something that had never existed before in America. A completely self-sufficient black community where people could live, work, and prosper without the constant threat of white supremacy. But Gurley didn't keep this opportunity to himself. He began loaning money to other black entrepreneurs who wanted to start businesses in what would become known as the Greenwood District. He built a grocery store on an avenue he named Greenwood, after a town in Mississippi, where many of his early residents had come from. Soon he added square 2-story brick boarding houses near his store, and before long the entire area became known as Greenwood. The oil boom that hit Tulsa in 1905 created unprecedented opportunities. While white oil barons were getting rich, something remarkable was happening north of the railroad tracks in Greenwood. Black families from across the South heard about this place where they could actually build wealth and live with dignity. They came by the hundreds, then by the thousands. By 1920, Greenwood had grown from Gurley's single grocery store into a thriving community of nearly 10,000 residents. The main thoroughfare, Greenwood Avenue, became a bustling center of commerce that would earn a nickname that captured the imagination of Black America. Dr. Booker T. Washington, the founder of Tuskegee Institute, visited Greenwood in the 1910s and was amazed by what he saw. He proclaimed that he had been to Harlem, Memphis, and Chicago, but had never seen African Americans prosper like they were prospering in Tulsa Greenwood. He called it the Black Wall Street of America. And Dr. Washington wasn't exaggerating. Greenwood Avenue was lined with luxury shops, hotels, nightclubs, beauty parlors, drugstores, restaurants, and professional offices. There were 2 theaters, 2 newspapers, more than a dozen churches, an all-black branch library, a AMDE branch, and even a hospital. Black doctors, lawyers, dentists, and other professionals had their offices right alongside successful business owners and entrepreneurs. The numbers were staggering. By 1921, Greenwood had over 300 black-owned businesses spanning 35 city blocks. The community was home to luxury establishments that could compete with the finest white businesses in the state. J.B. Stratford, considered a co-creator of Black Wall Street alongside Gurley, built what was said to be the finest hotel in all of Tulsa, a 54-suite luxury establishment that was the largest black-owned hotel in the United States at the time. John and Lula Williams owned multiple businesses, including the famous Williams Confectionery and the crown jewel of Greenwood, the Dreamland Theater. The Dreamland was a 750-seat venue that showed both live performances and the latest silent films. It was believed to be Tulsa's first movie theater, and it represented everything that Greenwood stood for: black excellence, black pride, and black prosperity. The economic success of Greenwood was built on a simple but powerful principle: black dollars stayed in black hands. When someone in Greenwood made money working for white oil companies or wealthy white families, they spent that money at black-owned businesses in their own community. Those business owners then hired other residents of Greenwood and purchased from other black businesses. Historians estimate that a dollar would circulate through the Greenwood community 36 times before leaving, and money might remain in Greenwood for as long as a year. This wasn't just about money. It was about dignity. In a time when black Americans across the country faced constant humiliation, violence, and economic exclusion, Greenwood offered something precious: respect. As survivor accounts tell us, Greenwood was a place where black people could be treated with dignity, where their children could attend good schools, and where they could build generational wealth. The success stories were remarkable. O.W. Gurley's net worth had grown to $150,000 by 1921, equivalent to about $7 million today's currency. Simon Berry had created a transportation empire that included taxi services and even chartered private planes to fly oil executives into Tulsa. At a time when the entire state of Oklahoma had only 2 airports, 6 black families in Greenwood owned their own private planes. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about Greenwood wasn't the wealth. It was the community. Families lived in beautiful craftsman-style homes. Children played safely in the streets. Adults gathered at social clubs and churches. Young people courted and married and started families with hope for the future. This was what black America could be when given the chance to flourish. Dr. Ansi Jackson exemplified everything Greenwood represented. Jackson was born in Memphis in 1879 and had become one of the most skilled surgeons in the country. The Mayo brothers, founders of the famous Mayo Clinic, called him the most able Negro surgeon in America. Dr. Jackson had invented surgical tools that are still used today, and he served patients of all races from his practice in Greenwood. He lived on one of the most exclusive blocks in Greenwood, alongside the principal of Booker T. Washington High School and the publisher of the Tulsa Star newspaper. For residents like Mary Jones Parrish, who arrived in 1918, Greenwood represented hope itself. She wrote that she came not because she was lured by the dream of making money, but because of the wonderful cooperation I observed among our people, and especially the harmony of spirit and action that existed between the businessmen and women. This was Black Wall Street in its glory, a place where the impossible had become reality, where black families were building wealth and creating a legacy for their children. It was a beacon of what America could be if it truly offered equality and opportunity for all its citizens. But even as Greenwood thrived, dark clouds were gathering. The very success that made Black Wall Street famous also made it a target. White supremacist groups, including the Ku Klux Klan, were rapidly gaining power in Tulsa. By 1921, the KKK had an active chapter in the city, and racial tensions were rising throughout the region. Many white Tulsans resented the prosperity they saw in Greenwood. How dare these black families live in beautiful homes and drive nice cars when many white families struggled? How dare they create successful businesses and accumulate wealth? The very existence of Black Wall Street challenged everything white supremacy stood for. The stage was being set for one of the most devastating acts of racial violence in American history. But before we get to that terrible day, I need you to understand just how much was at stake. This wasn't just about buildings and businesses. This was about dreams, about families, about a whole community of people who had dared to believe that they could build something beautiful in a country that had always told them they were inferior. On May 30th, 1921, an incident occurred that would be used as the excuse to destroy everything that black Tulsans had built. Dick Rowland, a 19-year-old black shoe shiner, went to work at his job in downtown Tulsa, as he did every day. But because of segregation laws, Rowland couldn't use the restroom in the building where he worked. Instead, he had to travel to the nearby Drexel building, where there was a colored restroom on the top floor. To reach that restroom, Rowland had to take an elevator operated by a young white woman named Sarah Page. What happened in that elevator that day is still debated, but the most accepted account is simple. Roland accidentally stepped on Paige's foot when the elevator lurched. She screamed in surprise, and he quickly left the building. But by the standards of 1921 Oklahoma, even this innocent interaction was dangerous. A white store clerk heard the scream and saw a young black man rushing from the building. The clerk immediately assumed the worst and called the police. When police questioned Sarah Page, she told them that Roland had grabbed her arm and nothing more. She declined to press charges. However, the story began to change as it spread through Tulsa's white community. Each retelling became more exaggerated, more salacious, and more designed to inflame racial hatred. By the time the story reached the offices of the Tulsa Tribune, one of the city's main newspapers, it had transformed into something entirely different. On May 31, 1921, the Tulsa Tribune published a story with the inflammatory headline, "Nabbed Negro for Attacking Girl in an Elevator." The article claimed that Roland had attempted to sexually assault Page, despite having no evidence to support this claim. Even more shocking, the Tribune published an editorial, now lost but remembered by witnesses, with the title "To Lynch Negro Tonight." This wasn't journalism. It was an incitement to murder. And it worked exactly as intended. By evening on May 31st, hundreds of white Tulsans had gathered outside the courthouse where Roland was being held. They demanded that Sheriff Willard McCullough hand over the young black man so they could lynch him. To his credit, Sheriff McCullough refused and barricaded the top floor of the courthouse to protect Roland. Word of the growing lynch mob reached Greenwood, and the community faced a terrible choice. They could do nothing and allow an innocent young man to be murdered by a racist mob, or they could act to protect him, knowing that any intervention would likely lead to violence. Around 9 p.m., approximately 25 armed black men, many of them World War I veterans, made their decision. They drove to the courthouse and offered their services to help protect Roland. These were men who had fought for democracy overseas and were not willing to stand by and watch injustice at home. Sheriff McCullough, however, declined their offer and assured them he had the situation under control. The group returned to Greenwood, but rumors quickly spread that the situation was deteriorating. Around 10 p.m., a larger group of about 75 black men, some of them armed, made a second trip to the courthouse. By this time, the white crowd had grown to nearly 2,000 people, many of them calling for Roland's blood. What happened next changed everything. As the black men were leaving the courthouse, an elderly white man approached O.B. Mann, one of the black veterans, and demanded that he hand over his gun. Mann refused. In the struggle that followed, a shot was fired. No one knows who fired first, but within moments, gunfire erupted throughout the area. The Tulsa Race Massacre had begun. The black men, realizing they were vastly outnumbered, began a fighting retreat back toward Greenwood. But the white mob, now enraged by the deaths of several white men, was just getting started. Tulsa Police Chief John Gustafson made a decision that would turn a confrontation into a massacre. He began deputizing white civilians, and according to eyewitnesses, instructed them to get a gun and get a nigger. Local pawn shops, hardware stores, and sporting goods stores were broken into as hundreds of white men armed themselves. What had started as a lynch mob was rapidly becoming an army. By midnight, fires had been set along the edge of Greenwood, and whites were organizing for what they called a dawn invasion. Throughout the early morning hours of June 1st, approximately 10,000 white Tulsans gathered along the edges of Greenwood. They came with guns, they came with gasoline, and they came with a plan to completely destroy Black Wall Street. At 5:08 a.m., a whistle pierced the morning air. This was the signal. Machine guns that had been positioned on grain elevators and tall buildings began firing into Greenwood homes. White rioters had hauled at least one machine gun to the top of a grain elevator, from where they could spray the entire district with gunfire. Then came the invasion. Thousands of armed whites poured into Greenwood from all directions. They moved systematically from house to house and business to business, forcing black residents out at gunpoint and then looting and burning everything they left behind. But this wasn't just a ground assault. In what may have been the first aerial bombing of an American city by Americans, private aircraft circled overhead, dropping incendiary devices on buildings and shooting at fleeing families. Survivors described seeing turpentine balls and other firebombs falling from the sky as they ran for their lives. The residents of Greenwood tried desperately to defend their community. Black men with hunting rifles and shotguns took positions on rooftops and behind buildings, trying to hold off the massive white army. There was particularly intense fighting around Standpipe Hill and along the Frisco Railroad tracks. But they were hopelessly outgunned and outnumbered. Dr. R.C. Jackson, the renowned surgeon, tried to surrender peacefully. According to his white neighbor, retired Judge John Oliphant, Dr. Jackson came walking out of his home with his hands raised, saying, "Here I am. I want to go with you." Despite Oliphant's pleas to spare the doctor's life, 2 white men shot Dr. Jackson multiple times in what Oliphant called cold-blooded murder. This was the pattern throughout Greenwood. Unarmed black residents were shot on sight. Families were dragged from their homes and marched at gunpoint to internment centers. Children watched their parents beaten and killed. The elderly and infirm were shown no mercy. Olivia Hooker was just 6 years old when the mob came to her family's home. She remembered hiding under a table with her siblings while their mother covered them with a tablecloth. As those marauders came into the house, they were trying to destroy anything that they could find. She later recalled, "They took a huge axe and started whacking at my sister Aileen's beloved piano. Whack, whack, whack. It was a good piano and they thought that was something we shouldn't have." The destruction was systematic and complete. Every black business, school, church, and hospital in Greenwood was targeted. The Dreamland Theater, where families had gathered just hours earlier to plan their defense, was burned to the ground. The 2 newspapers that had proudly served the black community were destroyed. Even the library, a symbol of education and progress, was torched. When Greenwood's own fire department tried to respond to the growing fires, white guards threatened them with violence if they attempted to help. The message was clear. Black Wall Street was meant to burn. By 9:15 a.m., when additional National Guard troops finally arrived, most of Greenwood had already been reduced to ashes. The massacre officially ended around 11:29 a.m., but the horror continued. Instead of arresting the white perpetrators, the National Guard began rounding up black survivors and marching them to internment camps. The statistics of destruction are staggering, but they can barely convey the human cost. The official death toll was recorded as just 36 people. But historians now believe that between 150 and 300 people, mostly African Americans, were killed. More than 800 people were injured. Over 1,250 homes were burned to the ground. 35 blocks, the entire heart of Black Wall Street, were reduced to rubble. But the numbers tell only part of the story. As many as 6,000 black residents were held in internment camps, some for as long as 8 days. These Americans were treated like prisoners of war in their own country, guarded by armed men and forced to work without pay. Nearly 10,000 people, virtually the entire black population of northern Tulsa, were left homeless. The economic devastation was calculated at the time to be over $1.50 million in real estate damage and $750,000 in personal property, equivalent to more than $33 in today's dollars. But insurance companies, claiming the destruction was due to riot rather than a coordinated attack, refused to pay out on policies held by black property owners. The survivors were left to rebuild entirely on their own, with no help from the city, state, or federal government. Viola Fletcher, who was just 7 years old during the massacre, later testified before Congress about what she lost that night. "I will never forget the violence of the white mob when we left our home. I still see black men being shot, black bodies lying in the street. I still smell smoke and see fire. I still see black businesses being burned. I still hear airplanes flying overhead. I hear the screams," she said. "I have lived through the massacre every day, but perhaps the most devastating aspect of the massacre was how completely it was covered up. Despite being one of the worst incidents of domestic terrorism in American history, the Tulsa Race Massacre was barely mentioned in history books for decades. White authorities blamed black residents for the violence, and an all-white grand jury cleared the city of any responsibility. No white person was ever prosecuted for the murders, arsons, and other crimes committed during those 2 days. The silence was intentional. White Tulsa wanted to pretend the massacre never happened, and they largely succeeded. For generations, children grew up in Tulsa without learning about the destruction of Black Wall Street in their schools. The story was literally erased from official records and public memory. Yet even in the face of such devastating loss and official indifference, the survivors of Greenwood refused to be broken. In what can only be described as an act of extraordinary courage and determination, they began to rebuild almost immediately. The city of Tulsa, led by Mayor T.D. Evans and the City Commission, did everything in their power to prevent this rebuilding. They hastily rezoned Greenwood from residential to industrial use, and imposed new building codes, requiring all structures to be built with brick rather than wood, a requirement that would have made rebuilding prohibitively expensive for most survivors. They unveiled a master plan that called for the Black community to be moved far from downtown, freeing up valuable land for white development. But Attorney B.C. Franklin, who had moved to Tulsa just 2 months before the massacre, fought these efforts in court and won. A panel of Tulsa County judges ruled that the city did not have the right to prevent Greenwood residents from rebuilding their homes and businesses on their own property. This legal victory made reconstruction possible, but it was still up to the survivors themselves to make it happen. And they did. Working often under cover of night to avoid police interference, families began rebuilding their homes. Business owners slowly reopened shops and offices. Churches were reconstructed. Schools resumed classes. By December 1921, just 7 months after the massacre, Red Cross officials reported that of the 1,256 homes that had been destroyed, 764 were already being rebuilt. By 1922, just 1 year after the massacre, 80 businesses had reopened in Greenwood. The reconstruction was so rapid and comprehensive that it amazed outside observers. A massive rebuilding effort was completed without any help from the greater Tulsa community, and remarkably, Greenwood began to thrive again. Survivor Eunice Jackson later recalled, "They just were not going to be kept down. They were determined not to give up. So they rebuilt Greenwood, and it was just wonderful. It became known as the Black Wall Street of America." Another survivor, Juanita Alexander Lewis Hopkins, told historians, "The North Tulsa after the massacre was even more impressive than before. That is when Greenwood became known as the Black Wall Street of America." Film footage shot by Reverend Solomon Sir Jones from 1925 to 1928 shows a bustling, thriving Greenwood that had indeed risen from the ashes. By 1942, Greenwood boasted 242 Black-owned and Black-operated business establishments, more than it had before the massacre. The community had not only survived, it had rebuilt itself into something even stronger. The Dreamland Theater reopened in September 1922, with entrepreneur Lula Williams celebrating the reconstruction of her family's entertainment empire. Churches, schools, and professional offices all returned. The community spirit that had made the original Black Wall Street so special was alive and well in the rebuilt Greenwood. For several decades, this new Greenwood continued to flourish. The community survived the Great Depression and remained a vital center of Black life and culture through the first half of the 20th century. Middle and upper-class Black families continued to call Greenwood home, and the area provided essential services and economic opportunities for Tulsa's Black population. But Greenwood's second destruction was already being planned. In the 1950s and 1960s, urban renewal programs and the construction of Interstate 244 would devastate the rebuilt community. Highway planners deliberately routed the interstate through the heart of Greenwood, destroying hundreds of homes and businesses and cutting the community in half. This wasn't an accident. It was a continuation of the same racist policies that had led to the original massacre. Segregation, while legally and morally necessary, also had unintended consequences for Greenwood. As legal barriers fell, many Black families and businesses moved to other parts of Tulsa, and the economic engine that had powered Black Wall Street began to disperse. By the 1980s, much of Greenwood's commercial vitality had been lost. Today, Efforts are underway to revitalize the historic Greenwood District and honor its legacy. The Greenwood Cultural Center serves as a memorial and educational facility, and there are ongoing discussions about economic development and reparations. In 2025, Tulsa announced its first reparations program for descendants of massacre survivors, a $105 billion initiative called Road to Repair. But the legal fight for justice continues to face setbacks. The three known surviving witnesses to the massacre, Viola Fletcher, Leslie Benningfield Randall, and Hughes Van Ellis, filed a lawsuit seeking reparations in 2020. Despite initial hopes, their case has faced repeated dismissals in Oklahoma courts. In 2024, the Oklahoma Supreme Court dismissed their final appeal, apparently ending their legal quest for compensation. These centenarians, all over 100 years old, represent living links to one of the most shameful episodes in American history. Fletcher, now 110, and Randall, 109, continue to speak out about their experiences and the ongoing effects of the massacre. Van Ellis passed away in 2023 at the age of 102. Their attorney, Demario Solomon Simmons, has called the legal battles another example of how America's, and specifically Tulsa's, legacy of racial harm, racial distress, is disproportionately and unjustly borne by black communities. The survivors themselves have stated, "We will not go quietly. We will continue to fight until our last breath." The legacy of the Tulsa Race Massacre extends far beyond the boundaries of Oklahoma. Modern research has shown that the destruction of Black Wall Street had lasting effects on black wealth accumulation, not just in Tulsa but across the country. The massacre was part of a broader pattern of racial violence that destroyed black economic progress during the early 20th century. In 2025, the U.S. Department of Justice released its first comprehensive report on the Tulsa Race Massacre, calling it the federal government's first thorough reckoning with the event. The report confirmed that the massacre was not random mob violence, but a coordinated military-style attack on Greenwood that was so systematic and coordinated that it transcended mere mob violence. The Tulsa Race Massacre represents more than just a historical atrocity. It's a symbol of both the heights that black Americans could reach when given the opportunity and the lengths that white supremacy would go to maintain racial hierarchy. Black Wall Street proved that African Americans, given a chance, could build wealth, create institutions, and establish thriving communities that rivaled anything white America had to offer. That success made it a target. The massacre wasn't just about destroying buildings and taking lives. It was about destroying hope, crushing dreams, and sending a message to black Americans everywhere that they would never be allowed to achieve true equality or prosperity. But the rebuilding of Greenwood tells another story, one of incredible resilience, determination, and refusal to be defeated. The survivors who rebuilt their community from ashes, often with their own hands, demonstrated the same spirit that had created Black Wall Street in the first place. They proved that while white supremacy could destroy, it could not defeat the human spirit. Today, as we grapple with ongoing racial inequalities in wealth, education, and opportunity, the story of Greenwood remains painfully relevant. The destruction of Black Wall Street wasn't just a historical tragedy. It was one link in a long chain of policies and actions that have created and maintained racial wealth gaps that persist to this day. The three elderly survivors who continue to seek justice aren't just asking for personal compensation. They're demanding that America finally acknowledge what happened and take responsibility for the ongoing effects of racial violence. As Viola Fletcher testified before Congress, "I have lived through the massacre every day. Our country may forget this history, but I cannot." The story of the Tulsa Race Massacre is ultimately a story about American promises. The promise of equality, the promise of justice, the promise that hard work and determination would be rewarded regardless of race. For the residents of Greenwood, those promises were broken in the most violent and devastating way possible. But it's also a story about the power of community, the strength of the human spirit, and the ongoing fight for justice. The fact that survivors and their descendants continue to seek accountability more than 100 years later shows that the principles that built Black Wall Street, self-determination, economic cooperation, and refusal to accept injustice remain alive. As we remember the Tulsa Race Massacre, we honor not just the victims who lost their lives, but the survivors who rebuilt their community, the descendants who continue to seek justice, and the principles of equality and human dignity that can never be destroyed, no matter how much violence is used against them. The destruction of Black Wall Street was one of the darkest chapters in American history. But the story of its rebuilding and the continued fight for justice by its survivors reminds us that hope and determination can outlast hatred and violence. The legacy of Greenwood lives on, not just in the museums and memorials that honor its memory, but in every person who refuses to accept injustice and continues to fight for the American promise of equality for all. That's why this story matters today. It's not just about the past. It's about the ongoing struggle for racial justice, economic equality, and the kind of America we want to be. The residents of Black Wall Street showed us what was possible when barriers were removed and people were free to pursue their dreams. Their story challenges us to remove the barriers that still exist and to build the inclusive, just society they dreamed of creating. If this story has moved you, please share it with others. The residents of Greenwood deserve to be remembered, not just as victims of violence, but as pioneers who built something beautiful and refused to be defeated even when it was taken away from them. Their legacy deserves to live on, and their fight for justice deserves our support. Hit that subscribe button, share this video, and let's make sure that the story of Black Wall Street is never forgotten again. The survivors are still with us, still fighting, still demanding that America live up to its promises. The least we can do is make sure their voices are heard.